Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to, first of all, thank the Institute and its membership for inviting me to come here today, and also for your forbearance, because I have to speak in English. I can't speak in Italian, which I apologize. It's a great privilege to be here for two reasons. The first is that the discussion this afternoon was about science in its different varieties. And it shows the challenges, and it shows the dilemmas and the progress. It's real progress. There's an optimism in the path that has been taken since the first discoveries, Pasteur, and of course DNA. Now we turn a chapter that you may not think is that relevant to the first sessions, but I believe it is relevant. Because my second point is that without the science, we would not understand the challenges that climate change pose for us all. So my discussion tonight, or this afternoon really, is about, I think this should go on, yeah, is about really trying to, in a very short time, give you an up-to-date picture of how climate change has been handled by lawyers. Now, that's a surprising statement. Most of you will think of law as being when you buy a house, use a notaire, hopefully not when you get into trouble with the criminal law, but more likely when you have a dispute between your neighbour over land, or if you're running a company or corporate entity, it's about how the company behaves in terms of its shareholders and executives and so on. So how come climate change is anything to do with law? It's quite intriguing. And the answer comes from my choice of just two cases, because I have to be very, very brief this afternoon. Two cases, one an Australian case and the other a UK case. And yes, you've guessed it, I've deliberately chosen cases from the common law world. Not that the civil law world is not also involved in this, but it is important that you see that the common law world began life in a slightly different way. It didn't have the corpus juris civilis to guide it. It did it in an ad hoc and practical way. So we begin with two questions. What is climate change? And it's hard to encapsulate it for people who perhaps are surprised that law has anything to do with this. It's about litigation, but it's not litigation as you know it. It's litigation taken on your behalf by pressure groups and organizations who are arguing that the climate is not properly protected. It's as simple as that. And to a large extent, it's relevant because over the years, the climate change litigation has been a pattern that has developed first in the United States of America, but then it has spread to other countries. And the reason it's spread to other countries is because many corporate entities, oil companies, and so on, are engaged in, sadly, creating pollution. And pollution has created a kind of problem that the traditional way of legal solutions does not serve. In other words, we have to go back to the old medieval times when ill health, atmosphere, oil and gas, these things were very difficult to understand, indeed to trace to a causal effect. Miasma theories abounded, smells. And then it gave rise to the 19th century developments where we began to realize that air pollution, smoke, inhaled by workers, asbestos, all these chemicals that are in the atmosphere as part of the Industrial Revolution spread all sorts of problems that governments had to do something about. There was a responsibility as an employer, but there's also a responsibility to government. And of course, over time, the EU took an important role in this, and that's become very important. So just to give you a very brief summary, I'll skip through some of this because it's quite complicated, but the gist of it is that over the years, there are about 200 or 300 cases a year, and there's an organisation in England called the London School of Economics, along with the Grantham Research Institute, that traces all this. So if you're into Google, you'll find access to the information, and I'm just condensing it for you. So basically what it means is that all over the world, individuals are getting into court, and these are an example of the strategic way cases are taken. And you probably have to think about this in another way. Yes, it's partly about policy making. And that is most likely to do with political decisions. So there's a political issue, a dimension to this, that brings financial and other aspects into the main throne on which these issues are dealt with. And in fact, many ways, the judges have to circumvent some obstacles because judges do not like to be seen as political actors. They like to be, as your scientists have told you this afternoon, independent. And if you notice, the copious and careful way all the authors of their papers this afternoon credited the sources, credited the referees, and credited the value of what they're doing as science that can be proven. So in the same way, those tests are being looked at, but in a court of law. And a court of law does not behave like the referee panel giving the grants, or a university that makes an appointment. They have to have a forensic way of looking at this. And I'm going to skip on just to get to the forensic way quickly so you have a sense of what it means. So the case I'm beginning with is the English case. It's the case that I think can very simply explain what the problem is. Let me explain. There is probably known to every one of you the concept of environmental impact assessments, undertaken as part of the EU rules, but more widespread, into whether a new development, be it a runway for an airport, be a construction of a power station, or the investigation of a site where oil might be produced. All that has implications. And here's the question. If a single site where an oil well is being dug is looked at, is it only necessary to look at the potential pollution from that site rather than the overall effect of the site producing oil? Okay, that's the single issue. Now, those who develop the site would like it to be only the site. That way it's easier. They only have to deal with the problems in that site in the extraction of the oil. They don't have to look at the broader context of the whole subject. And the dispute begins in our High Court, it then goes to our Court of Appeal, and then it goes to our highest court. And why I want to show you that is not all the judges agree. And in fact, in the High Court, there was this kind of, we don't want to look at this. It's probably best just to look at the site alone rather than the whole question, which involves government policy and issues about whether it's desirable to have oil or gas extraction. That's outside our remit. Court of Appeal basically agreed with that approach, broadly speaking. But here's where it gets rather interesting. The Supreme Court had the advantage of reading all the material, thinking about it a bit more. And they said something very important. Let me explain it in lay language. It's as simple as this. If I produce the construction of an oil well, is it not inevitable that that will mean oil will be burnt? That gases will be used? That inexorably that will result in pollution. And so they rejected this rather narrow approach that the lower courts had taken by taking this holistic view on the basis that a causal connection existed between digging an oil well, simple, putting in the pump and bringing it all up, and the fact that inevitably you would not do that without burning oil. And so they decided that the local authority, our planning authority, and central government would be acting illegal if they did not look at the environmental impact assessment more broadly. Now, I cannot tell you that that is an important decision in terms of its impacts. And many people regard that as a success. And in my notes, you can get a copy, of course, I discuss some of the dissenting opinions. So if you have a particular valued view of it, you can see different sides to the argument. And therefore, I might have given you the impression that environmental climate change litigation is a win-win. You can't lose the case, because basically, who is going to say that there isn't a danger with what you do? Who is not going to understand the impact for all mankind if something has a particular potential? I don't think that is what climate change litigation does. And my second case, I'm going quickly, is to go to the case in litigation that took place, the Sharma case in Australia. The case begins with a lot of cases being taken in other countries, Portugal and so on. But when we get to the Australian case, there's a very interesting argument that is put forward. Specifically, there is a series of articles of the European Convention, and specifically issues about the Convention of Rights in terms of young people, because young people are particularly vulnerable. We know that in terms of the diseases they may get, and also their vulnerability growing up, for example, to atmospheric pollution near schools and places of education. So what happened was that the case in Sharma was that after an optimistic first hearing, the federal court decided no. There may have been a duty on the minister to take account of various things to do with children and young people. But even though they were taking a case in person, it was not that the minister had breached their duty of care, because it's a policy decision in the end. And therefore they lost. And the children were, if you look at the case, you will discover they are told they cannot go back to court even when they grow up. It's a sort of bar against further action. So what does that tell us? Well, very briefly, two cases do not make an argument. But for this afternoon, I think they're pretty good examples of the dilemma between success and failure. And what I'm really asking is it worth it? Is it worth going on? Is it worth this? Is it actually desirable that cases are taken and that, in fact, litigation is used? Now, in my analysis of this, I don't think it is necessarily easy to say. I think my clicker's not working anymore, but anyway, I don't need it. I can go on. Basically, I'll bring the whole thing together in this way. I do not think that litigation would be my preferred way of looking at these problems. Why? Because litigation involves money. It involves finding specialist lawyers. The money involved is probably exponentially quite large. The fees of lawyers, the fees of court cases are high, and the cost is rather large to both government and to different organizations. So it's not altogether clear that litigation is the future, because what it is, it's a testament to failure, if you like, that policy has not in fact worked effectively. In other words, if someone had come to the earlier sessions here, they would have no doubt about what science shows. They would have no doubt about the evidential trail, the validation. So why does it need to be litigated? And here there's the horns of a dilemma. We live in a democracy. I'm not elected, but politicians are. I'm not a politician. So what right have I, as a lawyer, or even if I were a judge, to tell the politicians, no, you're wrong? And therefore that dilemma comes down to the question of legality. EU countries, broadly speaking, follow the rule of law, or at least they try to. There are exceptions, there are ups and downs and ins and outs. It's the pattern of human life. But the fact that the law has to be decided by someone, the question is it best done by the legal profession? Should it not be done by the way the parliamentary or the presidential system, in which case it applies differently, looks at these issues? And I think it comes back to this. Society has responsibilities to work out where do they put the balance of the responsibility. I think it's all on us. Your kids, my grandchildren, they all have a say in this. They're the future. And as you know, the International Panel on Climate Change in November sounded enormous warnings that in fact we're not getting to 1.5, we're not getting to net zero. Yes, we're electrifying our cars, we're doing various things, but not enough. So the question is, how is that expedited? So my conclusion is ambivalent about litigation, because I think litigation should be really avoided for the costs involved and the expense. And also, it's random. You're not quite sure you win. And all the cases that you've seen are all about appeals and more appeals and bureaucracy and so on. I'd prefer, and this is my final word, that we made the decision as a society, openly discussed it, just like we did this afternoon, where people asked questions, queries were given, and we could at least agree that our humanity is worth saving, not necessarily the legal profession and its fees. I've curtailed the lecture to cope with the time, but there's a lot of information. I've written a paper which will be available if you want to read it. I go into various techniques that are used by organizations to go against the pressure groups called SLAP. This is special strategic litigation against pressure groups, basically. And this means that they can be sued quite considerably. So it's another battle. But I don't think we should have these battles when we can win the outcome by persuasion and by responsibility. I believe that most citizens in most countries recognize the problem and want guidance to the future. Anyway, thank you very much.